Congressman Davidson, thanks so much for speaking to Base Politics.
It's an honor to join you. Thanks for having me on, Brad.
So, up first, I want to talk about the Fourth Amendment, which, for folks that don't know, is supposed to protect Americans from unreasonable search and seizures by our government. But you recently introduced legislation trying to stop something I didn't even know was happening. Apparently, government agencies can buy our data to circumvent getting a warrant when they want to surveil us. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so right to privacy is fundamental. The Constitution doesn't grant our rights; it's supposed to protect us. It limits what the government can do, and so things that the government would otherwise have to get a warrant or a subpoena, they've just been bypassing it and buying the data. And this is kind of a phenomenon that's taken place for a while now because Americans have shared their data in all sorts of ways with companies, and companies have been able to monetize that data. That's a different problem that we need to solve. I've got a bill called the It's Your Data Act that would sort of recognize that people have a property right in their data. That one doesn't have a path to move yet, but because of some of the abuses that we've seen going on from the federal government, we had a coalition of conservatives and progressives and said, hey, we should stop this. And so we passed a bill through the Judiciary Committee. It hasn't yet come up for a vote on the floor of the House. That had a coalition that had me, Andy Biggs, Thomas Massey on the right, and Zoe Lofgren, Zoe Lofgren and Pramila Jayapal on the left, and Jerry Nadler on the left. So three people, pretty good bill, and it goes through the committee unanimously. Well, we had one person who voted present, but everyone else voted for it. And so it was a big deal to say, really with one voice, the government can't bypass the Fourth Amendment and buy what they would otherwise have to get a warrant or subpoena for.
Yeah, so Wired reported on this bill, and they wrote that the FBI and the Defense Intelligence Agency are among several government entities known to have solicited private data brokers to access information for which a court order is generally required. And so they used our taxpayer money to buy it, so we were paying to circumvent our own rights.
Yeah, unfortunately, sort of the way I've seen what's happening with the weaponization of government, people are using our own government to undermine our country. It really is cutting against the values that our country makes our country distinctive. If we don't defend freedom, there are people that want to deprive it or deny it. And so once freedom's surrendered, it's rarely reclaimed. So getting this across the finish line will be a really big deal. You think about how infringed the right to privacy is. You think like the debates we have on speech, religion, the Second Amendment or whatever, people are guarding that more vigilantly. Privacy's kind of become something like, oh, well, everybody's spying on us anyway. And I think people have to understand that, hey, even if you look at like the Twitter files where speech was being canceled by the government, frankly, at the direction of the government, certain people or certain messages were being canceled or filtered. The thing that is the precursor to that is the privacy violation. Who said that? And there's a famous story about Khrushchev, who was the former leader of the Soviet Union, telling about how bad Stalin was and kind of owning the fact that, hey, Stalin wasn't all good for Russia. Here's some problems. And there were some people that were unjustly executed, frankly, and lots more. I think in the West all know how bad Stalin was, but he was telling people in the Soviet Union about that. So someone from the crowd yelled, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you say anything? And Khrushchev gets very angry and he pounds his fist and he's like, who said that? I demand to know who said that. And everybody got really quiet because they're like, ooh, I don't want something bad to happen to the guy next to me. The person obviously was very scared and intimidated to speak up and say, oh, hey, it was me in that setting. And that was exactly Khrushchev's point. He was illustrating, that's why. And, it's one thing to have the speech on the one hand, but it's the other to say, who said that? Because that's where the retribution starts to take place. So if we're, working towards a police state, then no privacy is part of how you get to a police state. And if you want to defend freedom and have the system and way of life that we've had in the West and in America in particular, we've got to restore this right to privacy to defend freedom.
Well, one big threat to the right to privacy would be the distribution and creation of a central bank digital currency. For folks that don't know, that's basically a digital dollar, right? It's a digital currency issued by the central bank, so controlled by the government, to replace cash. You've been sounding the alarm because some people might think, oh, well, that just sounds efficient. Why not save some trees? Tell us why you're so concerned about the U.S. potentially developing a CBDC and replacing cash.
Well, there are countries all over the world doing this, and frankly, China is the most advanced in implementing it. What it does is it gives the central government the ability to completely control your money. It's called, programmable money. So some economists think it's great. We could simulate certain activities, and we could, motivate people to not engage in other activities in a way that's kind of how the tax code already incentivizes certain behaviors, like, oh, you get a credit if you buy, an electric car, for example. So there are things that you do to shape behavior with policy all the time, but they're decoupled from money. If you link it to money itself, they could put all kinds of terms and conditions on the money. And in China, they've linked it even further to a social credit score. So the government has control of the money. Everything about your own money is filterable and cancelable by the federal government. And then how they do that in China anyway is they link all the data they have, your geolocation data, facial recognition data, every kind of record that they collect, and they'll say, this person is approved to travel, so you can buy train tickets and plane tickets. But if you're not approved, well, you can't. And it's not like you even have to be a criminal. It's just disfavored activities. And at some level, these kinds of things have gone on in the U.S. People are debanked for, in some states right now, it's a challenge to bank marijuana proceeds, for example. So if you have a dispensary or a grow operation, or even if you're just an employee in a place like that, it's hard to get a bank account. So on the front end, you fight the legal fight, but on the back end, they use the money as a way to kind of filter or cancel or shape behavior. So at some level, that's going on now. But if you go back to like the Canadian truckers, for example, that were protesting, okay, it's Canada, but in theory, the same thing could happen in the United States. And people don't think about Canada as some, police state. Justin Trudeau said, hey, freeze the bank accounts of these people that are here for the trucker protests. And when they tried to bypass that by having people donate in Bitcoin, Trudeau was trying to freeze account-based Bitcoin. So the only way really around it was self-custody. So, these are things that central bank digital currency is what is known as a permissioned network, and the grantor of permission is the government. And so you could program it, for example, to say, oh, you're driving a Prius. You can buy gas for $2 a gallon. You're driving an F-350 pickup truck, $10 a gallon for you. All these kinds of things. And some people think that would be great. But to me, it's pretty, dystopian. I mean, if you think about Orwellian future, all these kind of dystopias have a corruption of money from its proper use and convert it into a tool for coercion and control. So why would the United States be working on something that's universally depicted as evil, but the Federal Reserve is actively working to build this kind of system?
Yeah, they are, right? So tell us more about that, because as far as I'm aware, they haven't given permission to do so by Congress, but they are.
Yeah, I mean, there's been nothing that Congress did to direct them to do this, yet they're posting job listings, hiring and recruiting people to build this. And to me, it's the financial equivalent of the Death Star, and they're essentially saying, well, we're going to build it, but we won't turn it on. So imagine for Star Wars fans, the Death Star is, this super powerful weapon that could wipe out planets with one giant blast. Once it's built, you have all the power in the world. So I think we have to stop that. And you say, well, just turn off their funding. Well, the way that the Federal Reserve is funded is unique. They make money by processing all the interbank transactions and, basically controlling the supply of money, M1, M2. And so they make money off of that in a system called seigniorage, but they're not on regular appropriations. So when we go into appropriations this year, Congress is planning, at least the House is planning, to turn off any funding for anyone in Treasury or other parts of our government working on a central bank digital currency. But to get the Fed, we really need a broader law, and so we're working on legislation that would do that.
Yeah, so what do we do? Because I don't know about, I think I know about you, I know about listeners. I don't want my money to expire and say, you must spend it by this date, or to say, well, you only get to spend this amount of dollars on gasoline per week. That's your digital quota, or anything. Because at that point, it's not your money, and you've lost your financial freedom, and you're basically a financial serf to the government and just begging them, please, sir, may I have some more? So what do we do about it? Can you guys pass a law to tell the Fed no?
We can pass a law, and frankly, I want to go further. I want to literally criminalize developing it. I think people doing this should actually go to jail. And why? Because you see things going on like, let's just say, you're going to cancel free speech for Americans. Well, you're not supposed to do that. Our speech is supposed to be protected. But at the FBI, no one is even getting fired. So when people cross the line, no one is held to account for infringing on the freedoms of the United States citizens. In fact, they just keep working in the agencies. They keep doing bad things. And a lot of them, get promotions or certainly continue their jobs just fine. Some of the programs just move to a different agency and they keep doing the same kind of work. So I think the surefire way to do it is to criminalize it. But even that says you have to have a prosecutor that's going to enforce the law. So it's only a republic if we the people keep it, but we really have a lot of work to do to restore it.
So let's talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine. You've been speaking out about it lately. What's your evaluation of where things are at and the U.S.'s involvement?
Well, we could do a long series on Ukraine, so I'll skip the whole history. But safe to say, prior to this recent invasion by Russia, there had been previous conflict there where Russia occupied Crimea. There was a state of peace between Russia and Ukraine, and then in February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they say they were protecting Russian people in the Donbass region and others. So there's a grain of truth to that. There were certainly people that were trying to pressure Russian speakers to not speak Russian, to try to take the Russian culture out, to take the Russian Orthodox Church out, replace it with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there were kind of cultural things that were in conflict there. One of my friends who was from that region told me that, it's kind of like, for an American to understand it, it's kind of like Quebec in Canada. They speak French, they have certain elements of French culture, but, they're happy to be part of Canada. They just wouldn't like it if people in Canada said, hey, you can't keep speaking French. So those were the kinds of things that were kind of debated internally in the politics of Ukraine. But kind of the tipping point came when the United States and Europe started working with Ukraine to say, we're going to make you part of the European Union and part of NATO. That's always been a contested issue for the Soviet Union, for post-Soviet Union Russia, and certainly for Vladimir Putin. So there was escalation of tensions between that. Russia invades. It's unjust for Putin to have done this. And I think, early on, of the famous thing that Zelensky said was, I don't need a ride out, which Biden administration had apparently offered to get him safely out of the country. He said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, which inspired, not only his own countrymen, but people around the world to help him. They've put up a strong defense. And the challenge is that the Biden administration and others haven't committed to a specific outcome there. And so while, hundreds of billions of dollars have flowed into there, 113 from the United States alone, there isn't a clear outcome. It's like, well, of course, the outcome is to get the Russians out of Ukraine. Well, that's not going very well. Ukraine doesn't actually have enough combat power to extract Russia from Ukraine. So what is going on? Senator Warner, a Democrat senator from Virginia, he's the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He kind of summed it up by saying it's great because the Russian army is being ground down and we're not having to fight, we just have to spend money, but it's well worth it to grind down the Russian army. The problem with that is it's at the expense of Ukraine's army and frankly the entire country of Ukraine without really changing the outcome. So if the goal there is to simply make sure the war doesn't spread to NATO, that's a limited objective that we've probably given enough resources that you could make sure it doesn't spread to NATO. But you're holding out this false hope that there's more there for Ukraine, and it's getting a lot of people killed. So while there's a possibility of several variations of a just war, I don't think it's being waged justly. And without a clear statement of mission by the administration, you can't hold anyone accountable for failure. And if they were to succeed or claim success, you couldn't properly celebrate, mission accomplished if that was the case. So that's supposed to be done up front. Here's the mission. That way you know how many resources they need to accomplish the mission. And frankly, you could say, I'm not on board with that. I mean, some people in the administration have said the real mission is to have regime change in Russia and war crimes tribunals for Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's a horrible cost that would be borne to do it. Would it be just, given that he invaded his neighbor? Yeah, you could make an argument that that would be a just war too, but I don't think the American people are ready to make that kind of commitment.
Yeah, I have a couple concerns. My sympathies obviously lie with the Ukrainian people, and I completely agree that the Putin's invasion was unjust. But one of my concerns is where all this money is going, right? You mentioned 113 billion. There's been even more approved, but people like Rand Paul have tried to just have like basic inspector generals attached to this money, tracking it, and been shot down. And that's seriously concerning to me because I'm old enough to remember how we left billions of dollars of military equipment in Afghanistan that now is literally armed. We've armed the Taliban, right? So how do you think something similar is going to happen here where we're just pumping money and resources into this nation in chaos and we have no idea where it's going or how it's being spent or if it's going to end up, in the arms of bad people?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Ukrainian government has been identified as one of the more corrupt governments in the world. And of our allies, I mean, there are a lot of corrupt governments in the world. We're generally not partners with them. Ukraine, we're treating as if they're a full ally, but they do have a lot of corruption. So it's kind of like the biggest no-brainer in the world to put an inspector general to follow the money. And I think the other thing that a lot of people have concerns about is there another pretext for this war that no one wants to verbalize? Because certainly there have been lots of accusations that this is covering up for things that the Biden administration was involved in or things that were being done in Ukraine. That Russia might want to expose that would be, at a minimum embarrassing for the United States or problematic for the Biden administration. So recall Donald Trump was impeached because he said, hey, can somebody look into this way that Joe Biden got the prosecutor in Ukraine fired or threatened to get him fired unless he dropped his investigation into Burisma and some corruption there. So for calling for an investigation into corruption in Ukraine, ultimately that's where one of the impeachments of President Trump happened. The reality is it looks like those kinds of things actually happened, and they have ties back to the Biden administration, or at least Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and frankly some other family members now. So is this really some sort of cover-up operation, and we're using the power of the country to do this, and including baiting Russia into a war in Ukraine? Think how unjust that would be for the people of Ukraine if that in fact is the case. And here's the deal. You mentioned Afghanistan. We left Afghanistan on a date certain, August 31st. Now, you don't have to have been in the military to know that the first thing you do is get the civilians out, then you get the military out. We did it the other way in Afghanistan. But on August 31st, we leave Afghanistan. On September 1st of 2021, the United States entered into a strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine that really started the escalation here. That said, hey, we're going to back Ukraine being a member of NATO. And obviously that was something that was treated as an escalation from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, all right. Well, I want to shift gears and I want to ask you about one last thing because I think you know I appreciate a lot of your work. I've highlighted a lot, but I do have one bone to pick with you, and that is you voted against last session in Congress the Respect for Marriage Act, which would have codified gay marriage into federal law for the unlikely event that Obergefell v. Hodges was overturned by the Supreme Court, which I don't think is going to happen, but it would take away the uncertainty so, thousands of American families don't have their lives and families upended if something were to happen. So you cited your explanation for that as about religious liberty and protecting religious liberty, which is obviously really important. But I was kind of confused by that because I read this act and it's pretty clear. So just from the text, nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act shall be construed to diminish or abrogate a religious liberty or conscience protection otherwise available to an individual or organization under the Constitution of the United States or federal law. So what was the threat to religious liberty that got you exercised over this vote?
Yeah, there is language in there, and I'd have to pull it back up that does threaten organizations and basically says, well, yeah, maybe you could have an issue as a church where obviously the Catholic Church still teaches that homosexuality is a sin, so they don't hire homosexuals to do certain jobs within the church, and there are people that want to use this as the same thing as saying, well, that's like saying you don't hire black people, so you can't do that. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't teach that it's sinful to be black. There are no credible religions that do that. But the idea that you could use the law to impose it on a church is broadly rejected, and I think it's fairly clear in the law that the church couldn't be compelled to do that. But when you look at others in the economy, in workplace and everything else, you've seen numerous cases on this, and they get decided and they get treated falsely in the public. So, for example, there's a baker and recently a website developer that had to go all the way to the Supreme Court, spend a fortune defending themselves and because they were accused of discriminating against gay people. In the case of both of them, they're like, I don't discriminate against gay people. If you want me to build you a website, I'll build you a website, whatever you want to do. Oh, you want me to do your wedding site? No, I don't. I'm not going to do that. If you want me to build you a cake, I will build you a cake. Whatever cake you want, no problem. Well, no, I won't do wedding cakes that do this because of my faith. And we keep winning eventually in Supreme Court. But that's exactly what one of the sections and phrases in that bill was designed to say. We're going to flip the script on those cases, and we're going to make it so, yeah, you're going to do whatever somebody walks in the door and tells you to do. And that's a big infringement on religious freedom in our country.
So I have a couple questions about that because it would seem to me the part that I read you from the bill would make clear that there is no limitation. I don't think this bill enhances religious liberty, but the Masterpiece, and I've defended, to be clear, we're on the same page about Masterpiece Cake Shop, about 303 Creative. I don't think they should be compelled against their religion to create a service, just like I, as a gay person, wouldn't want to be compelled to create a service against my beliefs. But I'm not sure this bill really implies that because the people who would be subject to a private right of action, it's those acting under the color of state law. And it actually, like you mentioned, has protections for churches and then makes pretty clear it doesn't abrogate the religious or constitutional First Amendment rights of individuals or businesses. It doesn't change them. So I just got to be honest, the religious liberty, and you were far from the only one to cite that as a concern, I think it just seems to me like a pretext. Like the truth is, a lot of Republicans are still just voting against legal equality for gay marriage, and I just feel like we should just be upfront about that's what that is. That's
Well,
what
I think
this
some
is.
people were upfront about that, and that's their position. But I think, we had amendments that we tried to get made in order for that, and they weren't made in order for a reason, because they don't want it to be clear. They want to be able to sue people forever, and they do lawfare to try to bankrupt people. And it's like, well, that's fine if you can technically do that, but we're going to sue you. And that's what the private right of action was in there for, was to basically weaponize the law so that we can just bankrupt you. Yeah, sure, you can have a cake shop. Good luck staying in business. We're going to keep you in court. And we could have had a small section put in there that would have corrected that, and Democrats refused to make that amendment even in order. They wouldn't even allow a recorded vote on it.
Would you have
So
voted for it if it passed?
if I had the amendments that we sought, yes.
Okay.
So there were amendments that I sought. I think Mike Lee had a counterpart amendment in the Senate. Couldn't get it through. So it's not this benign thing that a lot of people try to hold it out there and say, oh no, it's only about equality. Now there's a whole other agenda there, which is, to say, no, it's not just that we want to be accepted and tolerated. It's that you will actually engage and celebrate with us. You will no longer hold to your own doctrine. You will practice mine. And that's a line that's crossed in our Constitution. That's why we have not just speech protected, but we have religious freedom protected. So, I think that it could have been made clear, and unfortunately, people didn't accept the language that would have done it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a shame. I guess I just disagree that this bill really contradicts that, because we do have the 303 creative decision happening after this bill is signed into law. I feel like these things can coexist: First Amendment conscious protections and marriage equality under federal law.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, you had Obergefell, so, if you say, hey, we have court cases, why do we need anything? I mean, that's where a lot of people were on the whole law in the first place. But like I said, it is part of the agenda, in my opinion, is to be able to have enough things that are not clear that they can just bankrupt people who don't get on board with the agenda.
All right. Well, Congressman Davidson, thank you so much for your time today. Keep up the good work, and we will keep in touch. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.